Hello, in this video, I'm going to talk about the specific changes that take place during the stages of learning a motor skill. So generally speaking, a negatively accelerated performance curve or a learning curve is mostly what we see in motor skill learning, and that's what we have in this picture here. So early in practice, the learner is usually learning at the highest rate. So that's what we see early in the curve, is that there's a huge amount of learning that happens right away. And then the more learning that takes place, the slower the rate of learning happens as we continue practice. So that's kind of coined the power law of practice, which means that early practice leads to large amounts of improvement and further practice yields smaller improvements at a slower rate. So logically, it makes sense because in the beginning, when you don't really know how to complete that skill at all, there's a huge amount of room for improvement. So there's more possibility of achieving improvement. And then as you continue to practice and you've already been developing the skill, there's sort of less room for improvement available. So it makes sense that improvement would happen at a slower and slower rate at that point. Changes in movement coordination. So the motor control system needs to solve the degrees of freedom problem, which we've talked about in past videos. So just as a reminder, we must constrain the many degrees of freedom, meaning like number of muscles and joints and even motor units, depending on how we look at degrees of freedom. But our neuromuscular system has to figure out how to control all of the different variables, all of the different degrees of freedom to coordinate and control movement. So early in learning, we sort of freeze the degrees of freedom to control those degrees of freedom. So when we don't have the skill yet to coordinate and control all of the many degrees of freedom, what we tend to do is freeze some of them, like hold certain joints in a rigid position or couple certain joint movements together, even if it's not necessarily what will optimize the performance of that skill. So early on, we'll freeze some degrees of freedom and work on learning how to control the remaining degrees of freedom. Then as we learn that skill, we sort of unfreeze those frozen degrees of freedom, and we allow for more functional synergy. So we allow the segments to work in a cooperative way that is going to optimize the performance of the skill. So as we progress and we learn how to coordinate the movements, we incorporate more and more degrees of freedom to sort of refine and hone in the right movement coordination strategy for that skill. So eventually we develop a coordination pattern that's dynamically stable and more economical. So in the beginning, it's not very economical to freeze certain joints and not use certain muscles and so on, or overusing different muscles that maybe we shouldn't be using at all, but that's what's required to sort of freeze the degrees of freedom. So over time, we learn how to do it correctly and more economically. So changes in established or preferred coordination patterns. So throughout life, we are learning so many different motor skills, and it's things we don't even think about, things like walking and running and picking up a glass of water off the table, and all of these different motor skills that we learn over our lifetime. So we come up with sort of preferred ways of moving based on the different motor skills that we have already in place. So when we're learning a new skill, we tend to start by using motor coordination patterns that we already have in place from other skills. So what that means is that we have movement biases that develop because we already have other motor skills and other coordination patterns. So we tend to try to apply those to new skills, and we have these movement biases towards the old skills that we have already. And sometimes we have to overcome those to be able to learn the new skill. Sometimes the movement biases help us to learn that skill, and other times the movement biases compete or conflict with the new skill. And so we can overcome those movement biases and learn the new movement pattern, but it can be very difficult. It can take a lot of practice, and it can be frustrating when the person is working on that. So consider like somebody who plays a racket sport and is learning a different racket sport. Like maybe you play tennis and now you're learning badminton, or you play badminton and now you're learning racquetball. So the foundational coordination patterns are kind of similar because in both cases, you're hitting an object with a racket. But they're different enough that if you try to use the same exact coordination patterns, you won't be successful. And so that's what we mean, like, by having movement pattern biases, is that you're biased in the direction of the skill you already have. Like if you already play tennis, and you have to sort of overcome that and unlearn those patterns to be able to learn the correct ones to play, like badminton, for example. Changes in muscles used to perform the skill. So as the coordination patterns we use change, so do the muscles that are being activated to perform that skill. Early in learning, when we're first learning a skill, we tend to use our muscles incorrectly. We use more muscles than we need, partly because we might be using extra muscles to freeze degrees of freedom, for example, or we might be using more muscles because we're trying to compensate for lack of coordination with increased force, which doesn't work to achieve the goal of the skill, but we tend to do that when it's early in the process and we're just learning. The timing of activation of the involved muscle groups also happens incorrectly in the beginning. Then with practice, we reverse that. We learn to use just the minimal number of the muscles that are required as we unfreeze our degrees of freedom, and the timing of the activation is corrected. Changes in energy costs. So beginners expend a large amount of energy. We're using more muscles than we need to, and we're using them in an inefficient sort of way. We're not taking advantage of like gravity and inertia and other things that could decrease the amount of energy that we need to expend on an action. And then as we increase in skill, then we expend the most minimum amount of energy as we learn to kind of use the other forces and our biomechanics to our advantage. Changes in visual selective attention. So beginners tend to look around too much and pay attention to the wrong things that are happening in the environment. With practice, skilled performers learn to direct their visual attention to the sources of information and to the environmental cues that make the most sense and are most important for guiding their performance of the skill. People get better at directing their visual attention to the appropriate information earlier during the performance of the skill. So it's not just a matter of learning to pay attention to the right things, but also with skill, we tend to pay attention to the right things sooner in the process, which makes a really big difference in performance. Changes in conscious attention demands. Beginners consciously think about almost every part of performing the skill. That's the cognitive phase. And then with practice and learning, skilled performers perform almost automatically with little conscious thought about the skill itself. So we move all the way to the other end of the spectrum to be autonomous. Changes in error detection and correction capability. Beginners are not that great at being able to identify and correct their own errors without having instruction and feedback available to them. So in the very beginning, you're just learning how to do it. So it's really hard to tell what you're doing wrong and figure out how to solve the problem. That's where being coached is really useful, because then they're telling you, here's how you should be doing it. Here's what you're doing wrong. Here's how to fix it. So it may take longer to correct and or be less accurate when they do correct. Skilled performers are highly capable of identifying and correcting errors because they've learned the skill. They know how it should be done correctly, and they're better equipped to tell when what they're doing is different from what they should be doing, and being able to figure out how to correct that and do it very accurately and consistently. Changes in brain activity. So the neural structure in the brain changes as beginners become more skilled with practice over time. So brain areas that are active during early stages of learning are not always the same areas that are active during later stages. So as we learn skills, the responsibility of executing those skills sometimes transfers from one area of the brain to another to some extent. So in earlier stages, the cerebellum tends to be more involved, and that's probably because of the role of the cerebellum in using sensory input from the environment and from the body and proprioception. And we're using that sensory input about what the body is actually doing and comparing it to the plan to smooth and coordinate that movement. So in a new skill that we don't know very well, we're going to rely on that heavily, and the cerebellum is going to have an important role in being able to smooth and correct and coordinate that movement. As we become more skilled and we require less of that interaction, there's less involvement of the cerebellum and more involvement of the basal ganglia that is involved in the memory and retention and execution of that new motor skill. So it's less sensory related and more related to memory and learning of that skill. Automation of motor skills is associated with reduced cortical activity. So our processing efficiency is improved. Okay, so the more automized, I don't know if that's the right word, the more automatic the movement becomes, the more we learn that movement, the less we have to cognitively think about it. And that's just another example of how efficiency is improved, is we're spending less cortical activity on the movement compared to in early stages of learning. The brain undergoes structural and functional changes when new skills are learned. So it's not just the functional aspects. There's also actual structural changes when we learn new motor activities or motor skills. So things like increasing density of gray matter in certain areas, connectivity among different brain regions, and other changes. One area where there is not change through the stages of learning is related to sensory feedback. So learning is specific to the sources of sensory feedback available during practice. So if in the early stages of learning, we are getting visual feedback or auditory feedback or any kind of specific sensory feedback to give us like to steer us in the right direction as we are learning that skill, we become dependent on that feedback. So as long as we are receiving visual feedback during practice, during the first stage of learning, we are going to continue to require that visual feedback during later stages of learning. The sooner that specific sensory feedback is removed from the practice environment, the sooner and better we will be able to adapt and learn to perform that skill without that feedback. So like, let's say you're learning a new skill and you get visual feedback for the first 200 trials compared to another group that gets visual feedback for the first 2,000 trials. When you're 3,000 trials in and you have no visual feedback, the group that only had 200 trials with feedback is going to be a lot more successful because they will have had so many more trials to practice without having that sensory feedback. So they will adjust to that much earlier and be much more successful as you move on. The longer you have that feedback, the more it interferes with your ability later on to be able to execute that movement without the feedback. All right. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.